The liver is the largest internal organ in your body, and it has over 250 different functions. The liver produces bile, and bile is important because it breaks down fats into smaller droplets so it can be easily absorbed in the digestive tract. The liver processes nutrients. For instance, the liver converts glucose into glycogen. Glucose is the most common carbohydrate and a key source of energy for all cells in the body, and glycogen is a form of energy storage of glucose. Speaking of glucose, the liver regulates blood glucose levels, and high blood glucose levels can damage nerves and blood vessels or lead to type 2 diabetes. The liver is also the great detoxifier. For example, it detoxifies alcohol and converts some fat-soluble toxins into a water-soluble form which can then be eliminated in urine. The liver also acts as a storage container, as it stores about 400 calories worth of energy in the form of glycogen. And it also stores iron, copper, vitamin B12, and all of the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. The liver synthesizes blood clotting proteins, blood plasma proteins, and transport proteins that carry fats and fat-soluble vitamins, just to name a few. It also produces several hormones and takes part in breaking down and eliminating excess hormones. The liver takes part in breaking down and recycling red blood cells. And I could go on and on and on, but I think you probably get the point that the liver has many important functions, thus making it an extremely important organ in your body. So take care of it.
There's a factory inside you that weighs about 1.4 kilograms and runs for 24 hours a day. This is your liver, the heaviest organ in your body and one of the most crucial. This industrious structure simultaneously acts as a storehouse, a manufacturing hub, and a processing plant. And each of these functions involves so many important subtasks that without the liver, our bodies would simply stop working. One of the liver's main functions is to filter the body's blood, which it receives in regular shipments from two sources. The hepatic artery delivers blood from the heart, while the hepatic portal vein brings it from the intestine. This double delivery fills the liver with nutrients that it then sorts, processes, and stores with the help of thousands of tiny internal processing plants known as lobules. Both blood flows also deliver the oxygen that the liver needs to function. The blood that is received from the intestine contains carbohydrates, fats, and vitamins and other nutrients dissolved in it from the food you've consumed. These must be processed in different ways. In the case of carbohydrates, the liver breaks them down and converts them into sugars for the body to use as energy when the filtered blood is sent back out. Sometimes the body has leftovers of nutrients that it doesn't immediately require. When that happens, the liver holds some back and stacks them in its storage facility. This facility works like a pantry for future cases when the body might be in need of nutrients. But the blood flowing into the liver isn't always full of good things. It also contains toxins and byproducts that the body can't use, and the liver monitors these strictly. When it spots a useless or toxic substance, it either converts it into a product that can't hurt the body or isolates it and whisks it away, channeling it through the kidneys and intestine to be excreted. Of course, we wouldn't consider the liver a factory if it didn't also manufacture things. This organ makes everything from various blood plasma proteins that transport fatty acids and help form blood clots, to the cholesterol that helps the body create hormones. It also makes vitamin D and substances that help digestion. But one of its most vital products is bile. Like an eco-friendly treatment plant, the liver uses cells called hepatocytes to convert toxic waste products into this bitter greenish liquid. As it's produced, bile is funneled into a small container below the liver, called the gallbladder, before being trickled into the intestine to help break down fats, destroy microbes, and neutralize extra stomach acid. Bile also helps carry other toxins and byproducts from the liver out of the body. So as you can see, the liver is an extremely efficient industrial site, performing multiple tasks that support each other. But such a complex system needs to be kept running smoothly by keeping it healthy and not overloading it with more toxins than it can handle. This is one factory we simply can't afford to shut down.
The pancreas is an important organ in the digestive system. It is located in the upper abdomen, directly behind the stomach and next to the small intestine. In most adults, it is between 6 and 10 inches long and 2 inches wide. The pancreas is comprised primarily of a network of tubes or pancreatic ducts that release liquids into the upper portion of the small intestine, called the duodenum. Anatomically, the pancreas is divided into 3 regions: the head, the body, and the tail. The pancreas has 2 functions: endocrine and exocrine. Its endocrine function is to produce the chemicals or hormones that regulate blood sugar, such as insulin. Its exocrine function is to produce enzymes that help to digest food. Pancreatic amylase breaks down carbohydrates or starches into glucose. Proteases break down protein into amino acids, and lipases break down fats. Because these digestive enzymes are so powerful, they are wrapped in a protective layer while they are in the pancreas. To reach the gastrointestinal tract, the digestive enzymes travel through the pancreatic ducts and are eventually released into the duodenum at the major papilla, also known as the ampulla of Vater. Once they are completely out of the pancreas, the protective layer is removed and the enzymes become active. Bile from the gallbladder also enters the duodenum at the major papilla. Bile breaks apart fat into smaller fat droplets, which are easier for lipase to digest. When the pancreas is healthy, it contributes to a healthy digestive system.
Chemical digestion kicks into high gear as we move into the first section of the small intestine, which we previously learned is called the duodenum. The duodenum is the area where many digestive juices enter the digestive tract. Now we see here that the pancreas is a triangular-shaped gland that extends across the abdomen, and it sits somewhat behind the stomach. The pancreas is a vital digestive organ because it produces a variety of enzymes that break down all of the major food groups. These enzymes are secreted into the duodenum along with a high concentration of bicarbonate. Bicarbonate makes the pancreatic secretions alkaline in nature. And this flow of alkaline fluid into the small intestine helps to neutralize the acidic chyme that comes from the stomach. Chyme is the term that we use for the partially digested food mass that's just passed out of the stomach. Neutralizing this acidic chyme provides a better environment for the activation of the pancreatic enzymes. Now, we will look at the digestive enzymes that come from the pancreas in just a moment, but before we do, it's important to note that the pancreas also has an endocrine function. Now, we previously learned that a gland can be either an exocrine gland, meaning that it secretes substances out through a duct, or an endocrine gland, meaning that it secretes hormones directly into the bloodstream. In the case of the pancreas, we see that it has both exocrine and endocrine functions. The pancreas is considered an exocrine gland because it secretes digestive juices through the pancreatic duct into the duodenum. It is also considered an endocrine gland because it produces and secretes the hormones insulin and glucagon into the bloodstream. We previously learned that these 2 hormones play an important role in maintaining a normal blood sugar level. When food enters the duodenum, it is deluged by pancreatic juice, which is defined as the alkaline solution of the pancreas containing enzymes that aid in the digestion of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. So because all of the major nutrients are either completely or partially broken down by enzymes from the pancreas, we see just how vital this organ is to digestion. Now, this pancreatic juice contains enzymes that complete the digestion of starch, called pancreatic amylase. In biochemistry, the most common way to name an enzyme is to add the suffix ase. Not every enzyme ends in ase, but if the suffix is present, you can feel pretty safe to assume that it's an enzyme. For example, you might recall that salivary amylase began digestion of starches in the mouth, so we see that amylase is an enzyme that digests starches. You may also recall that the digestion of protein started in your stomach. 3 enzymes found in pancreatic juice, called trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase, are the pancreatic enzymes that complete the digestion of proteins. Because proteins are held together by peptide bonds, these enzymes work by breaking peptide bonds. Therefore, it might help you recall these enzymes by remembering that trypsin and chymotrypsin trip over and break the peptide bonds, and that carboxypeptidase has the word peptide in its name. Now, to this point in the digestive system, we have not come across an enzyme that digests fats. However, pancreatic juice contains an enzyme that breaks down dietary fat molecules called pancreatic lipase. Now, fat digestion is a little different than the digestion of carbohydrates and proteins. Because fats have not been broken down before entering the small intestine, we see that an additional substance called bile must first act on the fat molecule and break large fat droplets into smaller droplets, so pancreatic lipase can be more effective. Let's review. The pancreas is an important organ in digestion because it produces a variety of enzymes that break down all of the major food groups. In addition to the enzymes, your pancreas also secretes bicarbonate, which makes the pancreatic secretions alkaline in nature. This is helpful because it neutralizes the acidic chyme entering the small intestine from the stomach. The pancreas is somewhat unusual in the fact that it is both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. It is considered an exocrine gland because it secretes digestive juices through the pancreatic duct. And it is considered an endocrine gland because it secretes the hormones insulin and glucagon into the bloodstream. The pancreatic juice contains enzymes that complete the digestion of starch called pancreatic amylase. It also contains pancreatic enzymes that complete the digestion of protein, called trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase. We also see that pancreatic juice contains an enzyme that breaks down dietary fat molecules called pancreatic lipase. Pancreatic lipase gets a little bit of help from bile, which first breaks down large fat droplets into smaller droplets.
I weigh about 80 kilograms. Most of that, let's say 64%, is water, though you can't tell by looking. I mean, as organisms go, I like to think that I look fairly solid. After water, the next largest proportion of me is protein, about 16%. Not just in my muscles, but also in things like the tiny sodium-potassium pumps in my neurons, and the hemoglobin in my blood, and the enzymes driving the chemical reactions in every one of my 37 trillion cells. And another 16% of me is fat, which I'm totally okay with. 4% of me is minerals, like the calcium and phosphorus in my bones and the iron in my blood, and 1% is carbohydrates, most of which is either being consumed as I talk to you or is sitting around as glycogen waiting to be used. But here's the thing, it's not like I just ate 80 kilograms of food and then all this happened. Instead, my body, like yours, is constantly acquiring stuff, extracting some of it to keep, burning some of it for energy, and getting rid of the rest. But even the stuff that my body does hold on to doesn't last forever. Some of the chemicals that I absorb in my food eventually become a part of me, but enzymes wear out and membranes break down and DNA gets oxidized, so they get discarded. And then I need more of those chemicals to reconstruct the material that I've lost. As a result, over the course of my lifetime, my cells will synthesize somewhere between 225 and 450 kilograms of protein. That's like 3 or 4 or 5 separate me's just made of protein. And all the protein and fat and carbohydrates and nucleic acids that make up me, of course, come from food. Every organism has to keep taking in and breaking down food to keep resupplying itself with the raw materials it needs to survive. And all that activity requires energy, which we also gain from food. So how do our bodies actually convert what we eat into energy and raw materials? The answer is a never-ending series of reactions that are dedicated to doing two vital and totally contradictory things. One set of chemical reactions destroys the reactants that you give them, reducing big, complex substances into molecular rubble, and the other set reassembles that rubble into new and bigger products that are put together again to make you. So our bodies are constantly reinventing themselves in a perpetual state of loss, but also always rebuilding. And even though all of this is happening at the cellular level, its consequences could hardly be larger. These two sets of reactions are where everything that we've learned so far about the digestive, endocrine, circulatory, and respiratory systems really starts to come together. Together, these processes make up your metabolism. Now, the sciencey word metabolism has come to have a meaning in popular speech, but metabolism isn't just one thing. People talk about metabolism as meaning like how fast your body body burns the fuel in your food or how high your personal energy level is. And that's fine for use by personal trainers and fitness magazines. But physiologically, metabolism really describes every single biochemical reaction that goes on in your body. And maybe more importantly, it reconciles two conflicting chemical processes that are always simultaneously underway inside of you. One of those chemical forces is anabolism. Anabolic reactions construct things and consume energy. These are the processes that take the small monomer building blocks in your food, like monosaccharides and fatty and amino acids, and build them into bigger, more complex polymers like carbs and fats and proteins that are used in your cells. Then, when you need new building blocks or you need to release some energy, those polymers in your body, or new ones in your food, get broken up by catabolic reactions. The processes of catabolism break down bigger molecules, and in breaking their bonds, release the energy you need to stay warm and move around and provide your cells with fuel to build those polymers back up again. To be honest, your metabolism is a lot like Sisyphus. It works really hard, but it is never finished. And the boulder that your inner Sisyphus is always pushing uphill and watching fall back down, that's nutrients, the molecules that your body is forever breaking up and then rebuilding only to have them break apart again. And these nutrients, the materials that your body needs to build, maintain, and repair itself, come in 6 major groups. By volume, the majority of what we consume and what makes up our bodies is water, so that's maybe the most vital nutrient. Then there are vitamins, compounds that come in either fat-soluble or water-soluble forms. They aren't used as building blocks or for energy, but they're essential in helping the body make use of other nutrients that do those things. Vitamin C, for example, helps improve iron absorption, while vitamin K is crucial to blood clotting, and some B vitamins are important in the production of ATP from glucose. Minerals, like vitamins, don't provide fuel, but they have all sorts of other functions. Calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus harden bones and teeth, while iron is, of course, crucial in hemoglobin. Plus, potassium, sodium, and chlorine help maintain your body's pH balance and are used in action potentials. So water, vitamins, and minerals are all necessary. But the 3 major nutrients that everyone always talks about, the ones you find on food labels from oatmeal to Pop-Tarts, are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Most of the carbohydrates you've ever eaten, with the exception of lactose in milk, originally came from plants. Mono and disaccharides come from fruits, honey, sugar beets, and sugarcane, while polysaccharide starches come from veggies and grains. The main thing you need to know is that the monosaccharide glucose is the be-all, end-all molecular fuel that your cells need to make ATP. ATP being the molecule that your cells use to drive anabolic reactions when they need to make new polymers or get anything else done, whether that's operating a sodium-potassium pump or detaching the head of a myosin filament to contract a muscle. But ATP is too unstable to store, so cells often store energy in the form of glucose, which they can then catabolize and convert to ATP when they need it. Now, some of your cells can get their energy from fats, but many of the most important ones, like your neurons and red blood cells, feed exclusively on glucose, so most of the carbs that your intestines absorb are converted to glucose for that reason. But if it's not needed right away, that energy can also get stored as glycogen in your liver and muscles, or converted to glycerol and fatty acids to make triglyceride fats. And even though there seems to be some kind of marketing war going on against dietary fats, we most definitely need them. The fats in your adipose tissue store energy, of course, but they also store fat-soluble vitamins and cushion your organs. Lipids also form the myelin that insulates the neurons in your brain and throughout your body, as well as the oil in your skin, and they provide the vital calorie content found in breast milk. But there are other important lipids like cholesterol, which is the precursor to things like testosterone and estrogen, and of course phospholipids, which form the cell membrane in every single one of the 3 dozen or so trillion cells you have. Now, if you're into eating meat, a lot of the fat you ingest might come from that, but guess what? Plants have fat too. Plants use lipids for energy storage just like we do, except they do it in fruits and nuts and seeds, which, when you think of it, are kind of like plant breast milk. It's food for their growing babies. Either way, though, when you eat lipids, your body breaks down triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. Those molecules can then be processed and used in the making of ATP, or they might be converted into other kinds of fatty acids, which your cells can then reassemble into your very own triglycerides or phospholipids. And your liver happens to be great at converting one fatty acid into another, but there are some it just can't synthesize. For example, omega-6 and 3 fatty acids are called essential fatty acids because your body can't make them, so they have to be ingested. They get turned into all kinds of useful molecules, like the ones used for synapse formation in the brain and for signaling inflammation during the healing process. But if carbohydrates provide energy and fats insulate and store energy, then just about everything else is done with proteins. They form the bulk of your muscle and connective tissue, but they're also what the ion channels and pumps are made of in your neurons and muscle cells, and they make up your enzymes, which are responsible for pretty much every chemical reaction in your body. In other words, your body runs on protein, and pretty much is protein. Nutritionally speaking, meats, dairy products, eggs, legumes, nuts, cereals are all particularly high in protein. But because everything we eat was once alive and every cell of every living thing contains protein, as long as you're eating whole foods, you're at least partially restocking your protein supplies. That might seem like you'd have to eat muscle to make muscle or eat enzymes to make enzymes, but that's not how it works. Since all your proteins are made up of just 20 amino acids, the differences between the thousands of unique proteins are simply in the sequence of those amino acids. And of course, you have a specialized molecule that knows just which amino acids to put together in what order to make a certain protein. It's called DNA. When you consume some hamburger, for example, the protein actin in the meat gets catabolized into its component amino acids, which gets mixed up with all of the amino acids from all the other proteins in the meat, like the collagen and elastin and titin and myosin, as well as all of the proteins from the bun and the tomato and the mayonnaise. Those amino acids then get reassembled using anabolic reactions into your very own but somewhat different proteins as defined by your DNA. Each cell is like a picky little Gordon Ramsay, and it has to have every amino acid needed, every ingredient present, before it will even think about starting to make a protein. And just like with your lipids, your cells can improvise and convert some amino acids into others if they're missing an ingredient. However, there are 9 essential amino acids that you cannot make from others and have to eat. Now, lots of foods don't provide every essential amino acid, but when you combine foods like beans and rice or pasta and cheese, you do get all of the essential amino acids, which is important because remember, after water, you are mostly made of protein, on the order of 16%. But what about the 1% of you, the carbohydrates? How that tiniest fraction of you ends up creating all of the energy? Here's a couple of words you might find useful in the study of human metabolism. They also happen to be 2 words that I enjoy in general. Brunch, buffet. You got eggs and bacon and French toast and biscuits and fruit and some kind of weird sorted jello thing in there. And once you've paid your $12.99, you know there's a pretty good chance that it's all gonna get eaten. But here's the thing. Not everything that you fit into your face during brunch time is going to be handled the same way by your body. After you're done digesting, some nutrients will go straight to your body's pile of stuff to burn right away, but others will have to be converted into something else. For example, the carbs and fats in your buttered toast can be directly oxidized into usable energy, but the amino acids in the bacon have to be converted into molecules that get broken down like carbs if you want to get energy out of them. And while excess carbs and fats can be stored in larger polymer versions of their original forms, any extra amino acids can't be. They have to be converted and then stored as fat or glycogen. So as I've mentioned before, the molecules in your body are constantly changing shape and renewing and rearranging themselves to either build things or to use energy. And eating food replenishes these nutrients, especially glucose. Then, depending on what your body needs and when you last ate, certain hormones like insulin will help decide what to burn and what to store for later. This, of course, is an important function, which is why things can go badly if this process doesn't work properly because of a metabolic disorder like diabetes. In that case, your body can't properly use and store nutritional energy, which makes the very acts of eating and metabolizing more difficult and possibly dangerous. Exactly how glucose levels can spike or plummet, how we convert nutrients into energy, and how all of that relates to eating and hunger and weight, metabolism, and your health in general is, guess what? Complicated. But as you are a living thing that must eat in order to stay alive, I'd say it's worth learning how it works. Waiting in line for the all-you-can-eat brunch buffet is a good time to recall the law of conservation of energy. The law simply states that energy can never be created or destroyed, it can only change forms. And the process of metabolism involves conversions of energy, either through catabolizing reactions that release the energy stored in your food, or anabolizing ones that use or store that energy. So you can enjoy your short stack of flapjacks and biscuits and gravy, but remember, that energy has to either get released or stored somewhere inside you. Now, the conversion of food energy is part of the great balancing act that is maintaining homeostasis, and one of its greatest tricks is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is how we derive energy from the food we eat, specifically glucose, which is where most of our food ends up. In order for glucose to become energy we can use, we have to give it some oxygen and convert each sugar molecule into 6 molecules of CO2 and 6 molecules of water, which usually produces about 32 molecules of ATP. Cellular respiration occurs in 3 simultaneous phases where glucose is broken down by glycolysis and other catabolic reactions enzymes, and then turned into pyruvic acid and acetyl-CoA, and finally ushered into the Krebs cycle. Cellular respiration breaks down nutrient molecules to generate ATP, and in doing so, it captures some of the chemical energy that was in those bonds for use in your body. Now, when it comes to how that energy is converted and where, that depends largely on when you ate your last meal. We all switch back and forth between two nutritional states: the absorptive or fed state, which is during or after eating, and the post-absorptive or fasting state, when the GI tract is empty and the body is running off of stored supplies. So say you're just post-brunch buffet and you're still in the absorptive state, unbuckling your belt as your digestive system breaks up the eggs and bacon and French toast and syrup into a bunch of mostly glucose molecules that pass into your bloodstream. The first bit of glucose gets delivered throughout the body and is tapped to generate ATP on the spot through cellular respiration. But since the meal was big and rich, there's more glucose floating around than your cells need at the moment. And remember, ATP is too unstable to be used for storage, which means all the extra glucose is going to get stored as fat or glycogen. And that storage is part of how you can end up gaining weight, because how much energy gets stored depends partly on your basal metabolic rate. That's the number of daily calories your body needs to do business as usual. And that rate can be influenced by your age, your sex, and body size or composition. A young bodybuilder is going to burn way more calories than that tiny grandma, but generally, if you're absorbing more nutrients than you're burning, you will gain weight. So yeah, for that, you can blame the law of conservation of energy. Now, of course, all nutrients are important. I mean, your body is basically made of protein, so that's kinda key. But in terms of immediate fuel, glucose is the easiest source of food for cells like your neurons, and it is always a good policy to keep your brain well fed so it doesn't get hangry or dead. So your body likes to maintain a blood glucose level of 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. But let's say that thanks to the buffet, you've now got 140 milligrams per deciliter. This means too much sugar is swimming around in your blood and your body isn't happy about it. If your blood sugar levels get too high, it can damage blood vessels, especially those in the nervous system, heart, kidneys, eyes, and extremities. That's why diabetes is often associated with a higher risk of heart and kidney disease, loss of vision, and foot amputation. But typically, rising blood sugar levels sets off a series of events that trim them back down. Specifically, they trigger special beta cells in the pancreas to start secreting more of the hormone that regulates everything that happens when you're in the absorptive state. And this hormone is the all-powerful insulin. Insulin's job in this instance is to move glucose out of the blood and into storage, and to do that, it triggers a shift from catabolic reactions to anabolic ones. For example, it puts a stop to glycogenolysis, or breaking down glycogen in your liver and muscles to release glucose for energy, and instead ramps up the process of glycogenesis, where extra glucose is linked together to form glycogen. It also activates lipogenesis, where very cool chemical reactions in the liver convert glucose to triglycerides and then ship them off to your adipose tissue for storage. A similar thing happens with the extra fatty acids that you got from the eggs and bacon that aren't immediately needed for energy. They get processed through lipogenesis too and are rebuilt back into triglycerides and then tucked away for a rainy day. The thing is, if you're thinking about this, all these lipids hate water, right? Fat and water don't mix. So you should be asking yourself, how can they be transported in the blood when they're so hydrophobic? The answer is lipoproteins, 4 specialized proteins made by the liver that surround fats and allow them to move in the bloodstream as an emulsion. You've probably heard of some of these. One is low-density lipoprotein, also known as LDL cholesterol. It's what delivers some of the glucose and fat that you just ate to your body's fat deposits. Another is high-density lipoprotein, or HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol. It starts out as an empty protein packet sent out by the liver to gather up other cholesterols from the blood and artery walls and other cells. HDL then delivers the cholesterol back to the liver, or to places like the ovaries, testes, and adrenal glands, which use it to make steroid hormones. Alright, so now your body has put all the glucose and lipids and proteins where they need to go, and you can just coast into the post-absorptive state. But several hours later, even though your small intestine is still working on what's left of the buffet, your cells have been helping themselves to the remaining glucose in the blood, and eventually, your blood sugar level will start to drop. Remember, your neurons are on an exclusive glucose meal plan, so they need sugar at the ready. And if your body senses an imbalance in blood sugar levels, it sounds the alarm. A decrease in glucose stimulates alpha cells in the pancreas to release insulin's nemesis, the hormone glucagon. It starts raising the blood sugar level by triggering the liver and adipose tissues to metabolize their fat and glycogen stores, thereby releasing fatty acids, glycerol, and glucose back into the blood. But if it's been a day or two since you've eaten, for some reason, and you've burned through both your blood glucose and your glycogen stores, and you don't have any sugars left to feed your brain? In that case, your body will launch into gluconeogenesis and convert fats and amino acids into glucose, so ATP synthesis can continue in your brain cells. This process is a sort of last-ditch effort by the body to protect the nervous system from the damaging effects of low blood sugar. Now, of course, this whole system has its flaws, and one of them is that the whole setup is almost entirely dependent on the proper release and reception of insulin. People with diabetes either don't produce enough insulin or have abnormal receptors for it, which is why they often have to inject a pharmaceutical version of the chemical after eating. Otherwise, their blood sugar levels will remain too high and they'll start peeing out large amounts of glucose to try and balance the levels in the blood. The problem is, because glucose is being excreted and not stored, it's not available when the blood sugar starts to drop, so the body has to draw on fat and protein tissues for energy, which is one reason why sudden weight loss can be an early sign of diabetes. Whether you're diabetic or not, I think we can all agree that it is important to respect your blood sugar levels and remember to continue feeding the beast. But at brunch, just, use small plates.
The gastrointestinal tract consists of a long tube that food travels through, which runs from the mouth to the anus, as well as to a number of helpful accessory organs that sprout off the sides of that tube. The gastrointestinal tract is made up of the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and finally the anal canal. The accessory organs include the teeth, tongue, salivary glands, the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. The main job of the gastrointestinal system is ingestion, taking in food, digestion, breaking it down into nutrients, absorption, pulling these nutrients into the bloodstream, and finally, excretion, getting rid of waste. Alright, so let's say we eat a slice of pizza. The pizza goes in our oral cavity where we use our teeth to masticate or chew the food up into small fragments. These fragments get tasted and rolled around by the tongue, which is basically a huge muscle that lines the floor of the mouth. The roof of the mouth, which separates it from the nasal cavity, is made up by the anterior hard palate, which provides a hard surface for the tongue to mash food against, and the posterior soft palate, which moves together along with the pendulum-like uvula to form a flap, or valve, that helps make sure food flows down instead of going up into the nose. At the same time, the three sets of salivary glands, the sublingual below the tongue, the submandibular below the mandible, and the parotid gland, which is near the ear, all secrete saliva to lubricate the food. The saliva helps to compact the food down into a soft, warm ball called a bolus. Saliva also contains salivary amylase, an enzyme that breaks long carbohydrates down into smaller sugars. Once that bolus of food gets swallowed through the pharynx, it goes into the esophagus. Right at that moment, there's a spoon-shaped flap of cartilage called the epiglottis, which acts like a lid and seals the airway off so that the food doesn't end up in the lungs by accident. Now if we zoom into a cross-section of the rest of the gastrointestinal tract, anywhere from the esophagus to the anus, the walls are typically lined by the same 4 layers of tissue. The outermost layer is either the adventitia, a thick fibrous connective tissue, or the serosa, a slippery serous membrane. Next is the muscularis externa, a smooth muscle layer which contracts automatically without you even having to think about it. If we look closer at this muscle layer, we'll see it's actually composed of an inner circular muscle layer arranged in circular rings which contract and constrict the tract behind the food, which keeps it from moving backward, while the outer longitudinal muscle layer, arranged along the length of the tract, relaxes and lengthens and therefore pulls things forward. Together, they perform what's called peristalsis, which is a series of coordinated wave-like muscle contractions that help squeeze the food bolus in one direction. In specific places along the tract, like the esophageal sphincter, the circular layer thickens, forming these sphincters that keep food from passing from one part of the gastrointestinal tract to another. Also, between the circular and longitudinal muscle layer, there's a plexus, or network of nerves, which helps coordinate muscle contraction and relaxation. This is the myenteric plexus, also called the Auerbach's plexus, which when activated causes smooth muscle relaxation. Now, surrounded by the muscularis externa is the submucosa, which consists of a dense layer of tissue that contains blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves. Specifically, buried in the submucosa there's a second plexus, the submucous plexus, also called the Meissner's plexus, which is responsible for helping to control the size of the blood vessels, as well as the secretion of digestive juices. And finally, there's the inner lining of the intestine called the mucosa, which itself consists of 3 cell layers. The outermost layer of the mucosa is the muscularis mucosa, or muscularis interna, and it's a layer of smooth muscle that contracts and helps break down food. The middle layer is the lamina propria, and it contains blood and lymph vessels. Finally, there's the innermost epithelial layer, and it absorbs and secretes mucus and digestive enzymes because this is the layer that comes into direct contact with food. Now, the esophagus has a particularly thick muscularis externa that propels the bolus of food down to the esophageal sphincter, which opens, allowing the bolus to pass into the stomach. In the stomach, there are 4 regions: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pyloric antrum. There's also a pyloric sphincter, or valve, at the end of the stomach, which closes while eating, keeping food inside for the stomach to churn over and over again. To help churn the food, the stomach has an extra layer of oblique smooth muscle within its muscularis externa that allows it to contract and expand like a big accordion. Also, the inner lining of the stomach has millions of tiny gastric pits that dive down into the gastric glands. These glands contain a variety of secretory cells which produce gastric secretions. Gastric secretions are made up of hydrochloric acid, which help destroy any pathogens that slip through the food, an enzyme called pepsin, which chops up proteins, mucus, which protects the stomach, as well as water, which turns the bolus into a liquidy pulp called chyme. Now, once the stomach is done doing what stomachs do, the pyloric sphincter opens, allowing the chyme to pass into the small intestine. The small intestine has 3 parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And despite its name, the small intestine can be as long as 10.5 meters, or about 35 feet, with lots of tiny ridges and grooves, each of which projects little finger-like fibers called villi. And in turn, each villus is covered in teeny tiny little microvilli. All of this gives the small intestines plenty of surface area to absorb nutrients. But almost no nutrient absorption can take place without the help of the trio of accessory organs: the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. First up, the liver is a massive organ that sits under the right dome of the diaphragm, and it makes bile. So going back to that pizza slice, at this point, the fats in the cheese are part of the chyme, and that stimulates the enteroendocrine cells, or hormone-secreting cells, of the small intestine to secrete a hormone, called cholecystokinin, into the blood. The cholecystokinin makes its way to the gallbladder, the thin-walled green sac snuggling up against the liver. It signals it to squeeze out some bile through the cystic and bile ducts into the small intestine. This is pretty much your gallbladder's job: store and concentrate the bile that's made by the liver until the time comes to squirt it out into the small intestine. That bile emulsifies the fat, essentially making fat organize into small micelles, which are tiny bubbles of mixed lipids and bile acids, rather than disorganized clumps, which makes them easier to absorb. And this is where the pancreas comes in. The pancreas is a long, skinny gland the length of a dollar bill, snuggled around the duodenum. Cholecystokinin stimulates acinar cells in the pancreas to secrete digestive enzymes that travel through the pancreatic ducts and into the duodenum. One enzyme is pancreatic lipase, which grabs the triglycerides hanging out in those micelles and breaks them down into fatty acids and glycerol. There's also pancreatic amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates into shorter oligosaccharides, and proteases, like trypsin, which cleaves proteins down into smaller peptides. Now, to prevent the hydrochloric acid of the stomach from damaging the intestinal mucosa, enteroendocrine cells also secrete another hormone, called secretin, which stimulates the pancreatic duct cells to secrete water and bicarbonate. Bicarbonate helps neutralize the acidic chyme. Raising the pH of the intestinal lumen also helps digestive enzymes work more effectively. A generous amount of bicarbonate is also secreted by a number of glands lying in the submucosa of the duodenal wall. At this point, we're almost ready for absorption. Fatty acids and glycerol can easily pass through the small intestinal epithelium and into the lymphatics. But to help absorb sugars, there are special enzymes on the top surface or brush border of the intestinal cells called brush border enzymes. These are maltase, sucrase, and lactase, which break down the short chains of sugars called oligosaccharides into simple sugars called monosaccharides. These include glucose, fructose, and galactose. Similarly, there are peptidases which break down peptide chains into single amino acids. The epithelial cells can absorb these nutrients into the bloodstream, and from there, they can go to the various tissues around the body. Alright, so whatever isn't absorbed, like fiber, continues its journey onward through the ileocecal sphincter and into the very last part of the gastrointestinal tract, the large intestine, also known as the colon. The large intestine is basically a 1.5 meter or 5 foot long loop that frames the small intestine and consists of 6 parts. The cecum, which has this tiny worm-like little outpouching called the appendix, the ascending colon that climbs along the right side of the abdomen, the transverse colon right beneath the diaphragm, the descending colon running down the left side of the abdomen, the S-shaped sigmoid colon, and finally, the rectum. When chyme hits the cecum, it's met by trillions of bacteria that colonize the large intestine. They're collectively called the gut microbiome. This microbiome is still trying to be studied and understood, but we know that the bacteria help produce essential B and K vitamins, as well as gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfurous compounds, which sometimes get released in awkward moments. The chyme slowly moves through the large intestine via small waves of peristalsis that take place over hours or even days. The large intestine absorbs excess water from the chyme, and that helps condense it into dry fecal matter. And that feces eventually ends up in the rectum. Once the rectum is filled and stretched, signals travel to the parasympathetic neurons in the spinal cord, initiating the defecation reflex. These parasympathetic neurons make the rectum contract and the internal anal sphincter relax. Meanwhile, signals are sent to the brainstem and thalamus, and when these decide the right moment has come, they allow the external anal sphincter to relax, and feces goes, hopefully, into the toilet bowl. Alright, as a quick recap. Food is ingested through the mouth, chewed by the teeth, mixed with saliva, and turned into a bolus. The bolus is then moved by peristalsis through the esophagus and into the stomach, where hydrochloric acid is secreted and pepsin begins the digestion process. Next is the small intestine, where most of the digestion and absorption occurs with the help of the liver's bile coming from the gallbladder and the pancreatic enzymes. Finally, the large intestine absorbs water, the feces forms and gets excreted through the anus.
Across the whole planet, humans eat on average between 1 and 2.7 kilograms of food a day. That's over 365 kilograms a year per person, and more than 28,800 kilograms over the course of a lifetime. And every last scrap makes its way through the digestive system. Comprised of 10 organs, covering 9 meters, and containing over 20 specialized cell types, this is one of the most diverse and complicated systems in the human body. Its parts continuously work in unison to fulfill a singular task: transforming the raw materials of your food into the nutrients and energy that keep you alive. Spanning the entire length of your torso, the digestive system has 4 main components. First, there's the gastrointestinal tract, a twisting channel that transports your food and has an internal surface area of between 30 and 40 square meters, enough to cover half a badminton court. Second, there's the pancreas, gallbladder, and liver, a trio of organs that break down food using an array of special juices. Third, the body's enzymes, hormones, nerves, and blood all work together to break down food, modulate the digestive process, and deliver its final products. Finally, there's the mesentery, a large stretch of tissue that supports and positions all your digestive organs in the abdomen, enabling them to do their jobs. The digestive process begins before food even hits your tongue. Anticipating a tasty morsel, glands in your mouth start to pump out saliva. We produce about 1.5 liters of this liquid each day. Once inside your mouth, chewing combines with the sloshing saliva to turn food into a moist lump called the bolus. Enzymes present in the saliva break down any starch. Then your food finds itself at the rim of a 25-centimeter long tube called the esophagus, down which it must plunge to reach the stomach. Nerves in the surrounding esophageal tissue sense the bolus's presence and trigger peristalsis, a series of defined muscular contractions. That propels the food into the stomach, where it's left at the mercy of the muscular stomach walls, which pound the bolus, breaking it into chunks. Hormones secreted by cells in the lining trigger the release of acids and enzyme-rich juices from the stomach wall that start to dissolve the food and break down its proteins. These hormones also alert the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder to produce digestive juices and transfer bile, a yellowish-green liquid that digests fat, in preparation for the next stage. After 3 hours inside the stomach, the once shapely bolus is now a frothy liquid called chyme, and it's ready to move into the small intestine. The liver sends bile to the gallbladder, which secretes it into the first portion of the small intestine, called the duodenum. Here, it dissolves the fats floating in the slurry of chyme so they can be easily digested by the pancreatic and intestinal juices that have leached onto the scene. These enzyme-rich juices break the fat molecules down into fatty acids and glycerol for easier absorption into the body. The enzymes also carry out the final deconstruction of proteins into amino acids and carbohydrates into glucose. This happens in the small intestine's lower regions, the jejunum and ileum, which are coated in millions of tiny projections called villi. These create a huge surface area to maximize molecule absorption and transference into the bloodstream. The blood takes them on the final leg of their journey to feed the body's organs and tissues. But it's not over quite yet. Leftover fiber, water, and dead cells sloughed off during digestion make it into the large intestine, also known as the colon. The body drains out most of the remaining fluid through the intestinal wall. What's left is a soft mass called stool. The colon squeezes this byproduct into a pouch called the rectum, where nerves sense it expanding and tell the body when it's time to expel the waste. The byproducts of digestion exit through the anus, and the food's long journey, typically lasting between 30 and 40 hours, is finally complete.
We all eat any kind of food to accomplish two simple things: to obtain the energy we need to stay alive, and to get the raw materials required for building all of our tissues and stuff. That's because when it comes down to it, both you and the food you eat contain those two same things. Both you and food are made of stuff, by which I mean matter, made of certain kinds of atoms, and both you and food have energy stored in the bonds between those atoms. So all living things need to take in stuff and energy and convert it into slightly different stuff and energy. And you can get some of the things you need pretty easily, like in order to get oxygen for respiration, to unleash the chemical energy in your food, you just have to inhale. But you can't just breathe in the stuff you need to build DNA or actin or a phospholipid bilayer. So, how does your body really acquire stuff? That's where the nachos come in. This cheesy, crunchy dish is made of all different kinds of biological matter like carbohydrates and fat and protein, and it contains a certain, probably shocking amount of calories, which is how we measure energy stored in the chemical bonds in food. So if I take like a 100-calorie bite of nachos, which probably with this much cheese wouldn't even be a very big bite, I can convert the chemical energy stored in those carbohydrates and proteins and fats to feed my muscle and heart cells and maybe like walk a mile, an activity that happens to use about 100 calories. But I can't just swallow the nachos and watch the lump of them travel straight to my heart or leg muscles. In order to actually use this food, I have to convert the biological matter into something my body can work with on the cellular level, which, as you know, is pretty darn tiny. And the work of converting the stuff in food into the stuff that's in my body is done by my digestive system. Human digestion occurs in 6 main steps, some of which you are intimately familiar with, others less so. But every step of the way, your body is working to reduce all the different kinds of molecules in food into their tiniest and most basic forms. When it comes to what your digestive system ultimately does, just think of it as a sort of disassembly line. You could have an order of nachos with the works. I'm talking beef and onions and sour cream and slices of jalapeno, and your digestive system will deconstruct it, both mechanically and chemically, one step at a time. It's gotta do this because your cells work best with materials that are in their most basic form. Your digestive system reduces food to that level in two main ways: by physically smashing it to smithereens and by bathing them, as much as it can, in enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that living things use as catalysts to speed up chemical reactions. When used in digestion, enzymes break down the large molecules in your food into the building blocks that your cells can actually absorb. Those large molecules are called biological molecules, also known as macromolecules, and everything that you eat, I hope, is at least partially made of them. And there are four main kinds. You got the lipids, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. Each possesses its own density of chemical potential energy, or caloric value. Like, for example, 1 gram of carbohydrate contains about 4 calories, while a gram of fat contains about 9 calories. But many of these biological molecules are polymers, or sequences of smaller molecules, and your cells aren't really equipped to take them up whole. What your body traffics in are those polymers' individual components, called monomers, and there are four main kinds of those too: fatty acids, sugars, amino acids, and nucleotides. The simple idea behind the whole digestive system is to break down the polymers of macromolecules in your food into the smaller monomers that your cells can use to build their own polymers, while also getting the energy they need. And what your body needs to build at any given moment is always changing. Maybe you need new fat stores so you can have energy to run a marathon, or new actin and myosin to build bigger muscles, or more DNA so you can replace the skin cells you scraped off your knee when you fell, or more enzymes so you can digest more food to get more building materials. To meet your body's constant and constantly shifting demands, your digestive system requires a lot of organs that perform a lot of specific tasks to break down and absorb the right nutrient at the right time. Now, I'm quite sure that you're familiar with the key players here. They're the hollow organs that form the continuous tube that is your alimentary canal, aka the gastrointestinal tract, which runs from your mouth to your anus. It's worth pointing out that these organs are hollow because you are basically hollow too. Your digestive tract is really just one unbroken, insulated tunnel of outside that just happens to run through your body, and it's open at both ends. You're a donut. So the layer of stratified squamous and columnar epithelial cells that line your tract is actually a barrier between the outside world and your inside world, but it's a barrier that allows for the selective movement of materials between them. It's these hollow organs that do the actual moving, digesting, and absorbing of food, and they include your mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, and small and large intestines. In your mouth, in your esophagus, and at the other end of things at your anus, you have stratified squamous epithelial tissue, just like your epidermis, to help resist the abrasive action of chewing corn chips maybe. From your stomach on down though, the inner GI tract is lined with simple columnar epithelial cells which secrete all sorts of stuff and which absorb and process various nutrients. Most of these columnar cells secrete mucus, which lubricates everything and protects your cells from being digested by your own digestive enzymes. So the innermost epithelial layer of the tube is known as the mucosal layer, and it contains some connective tissue as well, which supplies it with blood. Surrounding the mucosal layer is the submucosal layer made of loose areolar connective tissue, which helps provide the elasticity that the tube needs when you eat a whole pizza in one sitting, and it contains more blood vessels. And outside that, you have the muscularis external layer, which, as you might guess, is where you find the muscles responsible for moving food through your tube. Beyond these layers, the GI tract gets tons of support from the accessory digestive organs like your teeth and your tongue, your gallbladder, salivary glands, liver, and pancreas. They're kind of like a pit crew, and they mostly help by secreting various enzymes that help take apart food as it comes down the tube. Together, these two groups on the digestive disassembly line work in 6 steps to destroy your food and release and recycle its nutrients. First, of course, you gotta introduce the food to your digestive system. What you know as eating or ingestion is basically just creating a bulk flow of nutrients from the outside world into your tissues. This is where the work of disassembly begins, in your face hole, which scientists call your mouth. Now, we're gonna get into the details of what happens here another time, but remember that food disassembly is both mechanical and chemical, so your teeth pulverize the bite of nacho or whatever, while your salivary glands begin that food's hours-long enzyme bath. But the food at this point is not nearly micro enough to be of any use to your cells, so you have to move that mush further down your tube. This stage is called propulsion, and its initial mechanism is swallowing, which, as you know, is a voluntary action, but then it's quickly turned over to the involuntary process of peristalsis. In peristalsis, the smooth muscles of the walls of your digestive organs take turns contracting and relaxing to squeeze food through the lumen, or cavity, cavity of your alimentary tract. Waves of peristalsis continue through the esophagus, stomach, and intestines, and they're so strong that even if you were hanging upside down while eating your lunch and drinking your tea, the food would still soldier on, fighting gravity, and eventually make it to its final destination. All of this shipping and handling mechanically breaks down the food even more, and even after it goes through the stomach and its gastric acid, the mechanical work still continues once it reaches your small intestine, as more smooth muscle segments push the food back and forth to keep it crumbling up. The goal of all this pulverization is to increase the surface area of that bite of food by breaking it down into increasingly tiny pieces to prepare it to encounter more enzymes in step 4, chemical digestion. Really, the actual process of digestion only occurs when the main action becomes more chemical than mechanical. And here, the accessory digestive organs, namely the liver, pancreas, and gallbladder, secrete enzymes into the alimentary canal where they ambush the mush and break it down into its most basic chemical building blocks. Like I said before, our cells prefer to do business in the basic currency of monomers like amino acids, fatty acids, and simple sugars, and digestion allows for the absorption of those nutrients as they pass from the small intestine into the blood by both active and passive transport. Once those nutrients are absorbed by your cells, you can finally use the energy inside of them or use them to build new tissues. The absorption of the nutrients is the goal of the entire process. But of course, it is not the end of it. Once your body has sucked out all the nutrients at once, indigestible substances like fiber are escorted out of your body. And that is the end of the digestive line. In your digestive system's mission to disassemble food into its tiniest, most basic molecular forms, the stretch that runs from your mouth to your stomach unleashes all of the mechanical and chemical powers at its disposal. It physically roughs up food, douses it in protein-loving, acid-triggered enzymes, reduces it all into a creamy paste, and, as a bonus because it likes you, it also kills a whole host of harmful invaders that, for whatever reason, found their way through your face and into your tube. Let's begin with the beginning, with your mouth, aka your oral or buccal cavity. Now, we don't usually think of it this way, but that is where digestion starts, the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food through chewing and enzyme action. The inside of your mouth is lined with a tough, thick layer of stratified squamous epithelium that can stand up to lots of friction, like getting scraped by tortilla chips and like grilled cheese sandwiches that maybe were cooked a little too much on the top. Your anterior hard palate and the flexible posterior soft palate form the roof of your mouth. The hard palate provides like a hard surface for the tongue to mash food against, while the soft palate forms a movable fold of flesh that reflexively closes off the nasopharynx when you swallow, so food gets directed down your esophagus and not up into your nasal cavity. We all know what teeth are for, and you have roughly 32 of them in your basic types that help you masticate or chew your food. The tongue lives on the floor of your mouth and is basically just a big muscle that grips and constantly repositions your food as you chew. The resulting ball of mush actually has its own special name. It's a bolus, and the tongue rolls it back to the pharynx in preparation for swallowing. But that's just the physical action that goes on in your mouth. Just as much destruction is taking place through chemistry. The bolus is broken down with the help of 3 major pairs of salivary glands that churn out an average of 1.5 liters of slightly acidic saliva every day. More than 4 soda cans worth of spit per day. And all that saliva delivers enzymes like salivary amylase, a digestive enzyme that breaks down starches into glucose monomers. Now, once the food enters the pharynx, it's propelled by peristalsis into the esophagus, which, except for the little sphincter at the end that keeps food moving in the right direction, is really just a glorified laundry chute lined with smooth muscle. The only time you probably even remember that you have an esophagus is when something's stuck in there, or if you're feeling intense heartburn. Then the bolus moves on to the stomach. The stomach is the stretchiest part of your digestive tube, capable of holding 2 to 4 liters of material at any given time. 2 to 4 liters. That is a lot of nachos mixed with spit. But of course, it's much more than just a storage tank. It's lined with the same 4 main layers found through most of the GI tract: the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa, but it's got a few special modifications. For one thing, the muscularis includes an additional layer of smooth muscle that gives it extra strength, allowing the stomach not just to hold materials, but to actively smush them around. And the inner mucosa is made up almost entirely of mucus cells, which produce a protective coat that keeps the stomach tissues from getting digested along with your lunch. This inner lining is dotted with millions of tiny, deep gastric pits which lead down to tubular gastric glands. These glands, in turn, contain various types of secretory cells that brew up some of the most potent chemicals in your body. For example, your stomach has parietal cells that release hydrochloric acid, a substance more acidic than battery acid, which lays waste to most of the bacteria, viruses, and other stuff that could make you sick. It also helps denature or change the shape of proteins to make it easier for enzymes to digest them. And maybe more importantly, when the hydrochloric acid is combined with pepsinogen, an inactive enzyme that's secreted by another kind of stomach cell called chief cells, the mixture creates the protein-digesting enzyme pepsin. Together, this superpowered acid and protein-hungry enzyme can annihilate nearly anything they encounter. With so much mind-blowingly powerful stuff at your stomach's disposal, somebody down there has to be in charge. So your gastric glands also contain enteroendocrine cells. These cells release regulatory hormones like serotonin and histamine, which act locally to trigger other cells to, say, release more acid or contract muscle tissue. And when the time comes to tamp the action down, they secrete other hormones like somatostatin to inhibit secretions. And then there are G cells, which produce the most important hormone for stimulating gastric activity, gastrin. Most signals that increase stomach activity get the job done by increasing the secretion of gastrin, which then stimulates the release of other gastric fluids as well as stomach muscle activity. Now, if the smell of baking cookies has ever made your mouth water and your belly grumble, then it might not surprise you to learn that these stomach secretions are ruled by neural mechanisms as well as hormonal ones. In fact, stomach secretion occurs in 3 phases based on where the food is sensed: the brain, the stomach, and the small intestine. The cephalic phase is the one ruled by your brain, and it kicks in when you first see, smell, taste, or even think about food. That sensory input gets relayed to the hypothalamus, which stimulates the medulla oblongata, which then taps the parasympathetic fibers in the vagus nerve. From there, the signals are sent to the stomach with the word that, hey, we think that maybe cookies are on the way, so you might want to prepare yourself. Now, this is a conditioned reflex, so it only works if you want to eat the food in question. If I happen to be super full or not feeling well, or somebody puts a pile of squid eyeballs in front of me, the cephalic phase isn't gonna happen. And no offense if squid eyeballs are totally your thing, they're just not my thing. But say I eat the plate of squid eyeballs anyway, because, I'm trying to be polite. Well, even without the cephalic warm-up, when that food hits my stomach, local mechanisms, both neural and hormonal, jumpstart the gastric phase. For the next few hours, as my stomach grows distended from the food, it activates stretch receptors that again stimulate my medulla and get my vagus nerves to tell my stomach to turn up the juice. At the same time, the secretion of gastrin is activated by other signals, like the rise in alkalinity caused by the stomach acid getting neutralized as it does its job. Conversely, as stomach acidity increases, it inhibits the release of gastrin. Now, the third phase of gastric regulation, the intestinal phase, speeds or slows the rate in which your stomach empties so that the small intestine doesn't get too overloaded with too much acid or with the creamy paste that your stomach turns your food into, also known as chyme. Now remember, not a lot of absorption actually occurs in the stomach. The stomach is more like a decontamination tank. Sure, it pummels your food down to a paste, but it's also where your body tries to obliterate any nasties that could make you sick. As long as food is still in there, your body has a chance to kind of size it up and feel it out, and it reserves the right to eject anything that it feels is potentially dangerous. Lots of factors can trigger the stomach's urge to purge, or simply ingesting too much food or eating some kind of irritant or toxin, like those produced by bad bacteria, too much alcohol, certain drugs, or unappealing foods. Of course, if you've ever puked in a moment of trauma or stress, you know how emotions and anxiety can also trigger your stomach to launch its lunch. That's the brain influencing the cephalic phase of gastric regulation again by sending extra fight or flight signals to the stomach. Remember how the stomach is great at obliterating matter, but not so hot when it comes to actually chemically digesting stuff or really absorbing much of anything? You might say the stomach lacks subtlety, but luckily it's got friends in low places, and the small intestine is more than happy to pick up the slack and provide a cozy environment where your food is at long last disassembled and absorbed by your cells. Now, there's a lot of mechanical action and peristalsis going on here, but there's also a ton of chemical digesting too. And while homebrewed intestinal juices help digest the chyme enzyme that your stomach turns food into, the real power actually comes from the outside helpers, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Now, the small intestine is called small not because it's short, but because it's about half the diameter of the large intestine. The thing is actually like 6 or 7 meters long. Not only that, but the whole thing is lined with epithelial tissue that has more folds than an origami octopus. These folds are lined with tiny hair-like villi and even tinier microvilli, which create a truly impressive surface area, large enough that if it were unfolded it would cover a tennis court. It's this massive surface area and the countless capillaries just beneath it that make the small intestine such a champion absorber of nutrients. It shares the same 4 tissue layers seen throughout the GI tract and has 3 main subdivisions. Straight out of the stomach and snuggled around the pancreas, you've got the relatively short and mostly immovable duodenum, which is where most of the chemical digestion occurs. The middle section is the jejunum, where most of the absorption takes place. And finally, at the end, running into the large intestine, is the ileum, where important vitamins like A, B12, E, D, and K are absorbed. But the duodenum is what you might call the business end of the small intestine. It receives chyme and gastric juices from the stomach through the pyloric sphincter, but it also imports bile from the liver and gallbladder, enzymes from the pancreas, and it creates its own homegrown mix of enzymes. Some of the imported enzymes eventually pass through your system on the wave of gooey chyme, but other enzymes are actually bound to cell membranes in the intestinal mucosal layer, and they're reusable. Enzymes are proteins, and proteins are expensive, so these compounds, known as brush border enzymes, can just sit around and process food as it passes by without your body having to make new ones. And the lactase that so many of us don't have is one of these. Now, the duodenum communicates with the stomach in the last phase of gastric regulation, which we talked about in the last episode, the intestinal phase. This is where the duodenum lets the stomach know with hormones and nerve signals when and how much chyme to release so it doesn't get overwhelmed all at once. It's also where stuff like bicarbonate from the pancreas gets dumped to help neutralize the stomach acid before it burns a hole in your guts. And this brings me to your crucial accessory organs, the things apart from the alimentary canal that never come in contact with ingested material, but still play an essential role in digestion. First up, the liver. The liver is a massive, fatty, 4-lobed, and very important organ. It lives directly under your diaphragm, and fun fact, it can actually fully regenerate itself after an injury or surgery with as little as 25% of its original tissue. The liver serves tons of critical metabolic and regulatory roles that we don't have time to get into right now, but its main role in the digestive system is to make bile. Bile is the missing ingredient your body needs to attack fatty foods, which is a tricky business. In part, that's because fat isn't water soluble, and since your insides are mostly water, fats will clump together, becoming hard to digest. To keep fat from clumping, you need an emulsifier, so bile comes in to keep big hydrophobic fat molecules from sticking together, which allows lipid-hungry enzymes to move in and break them down into fatty acids and monoglycerides that you can then digest and absorb. But while your liver creates the bile, it gets stored and concentrated in the neighboring gallbladder, the thin, green sac cozied up to the liver. It gets the signal when chyme slides into the duodenum, which activates the enteroendocrine cells to release a pair of hormones. Those hormones in turn tell the gallbladder to contract and squirt bile through the cystic and bile ducts into the duodenum. Another crucial accessory organ is the pancreas, a gland that looks like a fistful of cottage cheese stuffed in a plastic bag. The pancreas also does lots of important things for your body, especially related to your endocrine system, but for our purposes today, just know that it brews up a powerful enzyme cocktail that is also triggered by those same 2 hormones. Pancreatic juice is kind of like the Neapolitan ice cream of bodily secretions. It's like everybody's favorite ingredients all put together, and when you mix them, the result is especially powerful. You got trypsin and peptidase in there, which break proteins down into amino acids, and you have lipases that turn triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol. Amylase, meanwhile, reduces carbs to glucose and fructose, and nuclease busts the nucleic acids that are in DNA and RNA into nucleotides. Once all those macromolecules have been disassembled into their monomers, the small intestine's epithelial cells can finally absorb and transport them through your capillaries and into the bloodstream, where they can travel pretty much to any cell in your body and be used to build collagen or store fat or replace dying cells. The final and true purpose behind all of that eating that you do. So, once the chyme has worked through your small intestine, it passes through the ileocecal valve and hits the cecum, the first part of the large intestine, where, congratulations, your food is now officially feces. The large intestine, consisting of the colon, rectum, and anus, is relatively short, at about 1.5 meters, and it provides a nice little frame for the small intestine here at the end of the alimentary canal. By now, your body has sucked up almost all of the nutrients it can and is basically just pushing indigestible goo around so the large intestine doesn't have a lot of hard work to do. Its main functions are to absorb any remaining water so you don't have constant diarrhea, and to store the rest until it's ready to exit the body. It also plays host to hundreds of species and trillions of individual gut bacteria which digest whatever chyme your body couldn't, releasing essential B and K vitamins and some short fatty acids which the large intestine can still absorb. In doing so, they also produce gases like carbon dioxide and methane and sulfurous compounds called mercaptans and hydrogen sulfide, which eventually pass. Those of us who can't produce the enzyme lactase in our small intestine simply let milk and cheese pass through the organ untouched, leaving the digestion to those bacteria in the large intestine. And those bacteria possess about 1,000 different kinds of enzymes of their own, including lactase. But their digestion process produces a whole lot of extra gas, which is why nachos may leave me feeling cheesy and satisfied, but leave you bloated and crampy and malodorous. But enough farting around. Let's wrap up this fantastic journey. Fecal matter keeps moving through in a couple of different ways. Slow segmenting haustral contractions keep mixing and chopping it in the large intestine, occurring every 30 minutes or so and lasting about a minute. But most people also experience a few mass peristalsis movements a day, big, intense contractions that clear out a large swath of intestine at once, pushing feces into the rectum. These often occur just after eating. Once in the rectum, your poop stimulates stretch receptors that tap the parasympathetic defecation reflex, which signals the colon and rectum to contract and the internal anal sphincter to relax. This forces the poop into the anal canal, sending more messages to the brain that allow us to decide whether to voluntarily open the external anal sphincter or just hold it for a minute while we find a bathroom. And when that moment arrives, what was once food says farewell to the alimentary canal that temporarily held it and passes back into the light of day. And that, my friends, is the end of your digestive system. Pretty cool, right?